Welcome to One Spark at a Time with me, Rabbi Adam Miller. A Jewish mystical legend tells that during creation, something broke and shattered, scattering sparks of divine holiness all around the world. It is our responsibility to do acts of tikkun olam, repairing the world around us. Each time we do a good deed, we are gathering one more of those holy sparks and making our world a little more whole and holy. Today, we're going to meet an individual doing the sacred work of repairing our world, one spark at a time. Rabbi Joel Mosbacher is a dear friend and the senior rabbi at Temple Sharei Tefillah in New York City. He is the recipient of the Torah Rabbinic Human Rights Hero Award in 2016. Rabbi Mosbacher serves on the National Strategy Team of Metro Industrial Areas Foundation, is a national co-chair of Metro IAF's Do Not Stand Idly By campaign to reduce gun violence. Rabbi Mosbacher has been featured in national news outlets, and he speaks and writes extensively on issues concerning social justice, Israel, and Jewish values. For those watching with us live, he has a picture of Tel Aviv in his background right now. He is also a contributing author to 3 publications from the Central Conference of American Rabbis, the CCAR. Those are The Sacred Table, Creating a Jewish Food Ethic, Moral Resistance and Spiritual Authority, and The Sacred Exchange, Creating a Jewish Money Ethic. Rabbi Mosbacher, welcome to One Spark at a Time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
It's a thrill for me to be able to share this time and space with you. For those who are in our audience, the two of us have been friends for many years, going back, I think, to 2004 when we first were on faculty together at URJ Eisner Camp in Great Barrington. Tell me, how are things with you right now?
Thanks for asking, and regards to you and your community and your family as well. It is.
Thank you.
It's a strange time for everyone. Weirdly, here in New York, it's like one of the safest places to be in the country right now. So that's an odd thing. But everybody is doing okay. The community is all right, and we're concerned about people that we love all over the country and all over the world and their well-being. But we're doing okay in these strange times.
They are strange times indeed. And to think back a few months ago that New York was a place nobody wanted to go, with the numbers moving higher and higher. And now we've turned, and Florida is the place where the numbers continue to grow. And New York, as you said, is getting under control. But overall, this is a chaotic time. And
sure.
It's a challenge for us. And in your role as a rabbi, I'm sure you're encountering a lot of these challenges. Before we talk about what's happening right now, let's help the audience understand how you reach this place. I know that I invariably get asked the question, so how did you become a rabbi? It's a cliche, admittedly.
That's all right.
But let us know what brought you to this calling.
Thanks for asking. And I never get bored of that question. I mean, I like to think about the journey that got me here. I grew up in a very active Jewish family, Reformed Jewish family in suburban Chicago. Sometimes people ask me why I became a Reform rabbi, and I half joke that I didn't know there was any other kind of rabbi. I grew up at a Reform synagogue, in a Reform summer camp where I met my wife, and a Reform youth group. I was chair of the Reform Jewish Students Union at the University of Wisconsin. And so Jewish living and Jewish life has always been an important piece. Yes, I appreciate the Wisconsin coffee mug. An important part of my journey. And as I did in my, I guess, early teens, and started to think about what are the things that might be interesting to me to do, I thought about being an astronaut. That's the only other thing that I ever gave serious thought to. I still would be happy to be I would still be happy to be the first rabbi in space, but unfortunately I'd have to tell my mom after I got back, because she would be too nervous. But I would say the biggest influences included my home rabbi, Leo Wolko, who just died about 2 weeks ago. So I've been thinking about him a lot. And actually Jewish summer camp, and the rabbis that I met there, who I got to just see as regular people, not people like up there 7 steps up on the bima, not in fancy robes, but like in ripped jeans and a t-shirt, hanging out with kids and doing Jewish living and Jewish life and Jewish teaching. And when I was about 14 or 15 years old, a couple of them, Rabbi Mike Weinberg, Rabbi Steve Bob, sort of started to suggest to me that I think about being a rabbi. And so by the time I went off to college, I had pretty much set myself on this path. It was not like one moment of awakening, but as I thought about all the things that I loved, Jewish life among them, and also the opportunity of especially having met all these rabbis at camp, some of which who were deep Torah scholars, and some of whom were, deep theologians, and some of whom were, I got to meet Arnold Jacob Wolf, who marched with Dr. King, and people who got to do all kinds of interesting things as a rabbi. As I thought about the things I wanted to be able to do, I could have been a therapist and just been involved in my synagogue, or I could have been, kind of anything and just had a really active Jewish life. But all the things that I most wanted to do, I got to see rabbis had a chance to do those things. And so I'm really happy to say that 22 years into being a rabbi, I still want to be a rabbi when I grow up. Because sometimes people have a vision of what they want to be, and then they get into the thing and they're like, oh no, this is not this is not what I thought it would be. I'm really happy to be a rabbi, and there's lots of influences that brought me to this place, and I feel very blessed.
It's remarkable to hear that journey and hear the way that those people influenced you along the way, especially your influence when you were there at Azrui Olenseng Ruby Camp in Wisconsin, and those rabbis interacting with them. Among the values that were instilled in you, either through camp or through your temple life, how did the pursuit of justice and social action become so meaningful to you personally?
It's a good question. Again, it came from various sort of directions, I would say. I fell in love early on with that teaching with which you began this broadcast. The idea that that when the world was created, there was a little bit left undone, as they say, and the idea. And I'm trying to think of who I first learned it from, because I like to teach Torah, the name of the people I learned it from. It might have been Rabbi Erwin Zeplowitz, who's now on Long Island, but at the time when I was a kid, he was like an assistant rabbi in Chicago. And I think it might have been him who first sort of described the idea that the question, why are we here? And a Jewish answer being to be partners with God in the ongoing work of creation. And when I first sort of heard that teaching, it just clicked with me. It just made sense. The idea that our purpose in life is to, in part, to make the world a better place because we're here. And so I had a variety of experiences in my youth group experiences, what was then called SIFTI, the Nifty region in Chicago, and then at University of Wisconsin, where I was the coordinator for the volunteer coordinator for the homeless shelter right on the square, right in front of the Capitol in Madison. And then when I was an assistant rabbi, as often assistant rabbis end up being, part of my portfolio was the social action portfolio, and I moved to Atlanta just after there had been a terrible hurricane that had come through. And so I had all these experiences where I began to realize and began to see the impact that communities of faith, not just Jews, but all communities of faith, can have on making the world a better place. And so it all added up to, it sort of clicked for me. And then I also had these affirming experiences along the way in which I saw the ways in which organized people could make a real impact in the world. And so it's been a centerpiece for me, but there've been all these moments along the way in which the theory became practice, and I really profoundly believe in the impact that communities of faith can have on the world.
That's remarkable. And we'll be talking about some of that impact throughout this conversation. After finishing your undergraduate studies at the University of Wisconsin, you entered Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion. That's the Reform Seminary from which we are both ordained. Mm-hmm. Talk to us about where you perceive the roots of pursuing justice in Judaism, and as well, why you think it's particularly emphasized within Reform Judaism.
Well, as Jews, we're inheritors of a prophetic tradition, right? Every Shabbat, we read something from the Torah and something from the prophets. And I feel like often, I'm sure not in every community, but often we focus on the teaching from the Torah, as we should. I'm not saying, don't hear me wrong. It's not like we should look at the teaching from the Torah, but paired with each Torah portion is a prophetic reading. And when you actually delve into those readings, you realize that the prophets of Jewish tradition, it's interesting to think about what is a prophet. If I ask someone what a prophet is, probably north of 90% of the time, people will say some version of a person who hears God's words and then says them in the world. And that is true, but it's not the whole truth, right? The prophets of our tradition heard God's words or experienced God through dreams or visions, but then used the words to try and improve the world. It's a subtle difference maybe, but they were not just mouthpieces. And so I feel like for me and for Judaism in general, our prophets are the inspiration to the idea that the world as it is doesn't have to be this way. Many of our prophets were reluctant. They didn't want the job, and who would want the job of telling people all the things they were doing wrong and all the ways they needed to change, especially when they were speaking to the king. But again and again, they want to make the world better through God's teaching, through Jewish tradition. They believe that it's not enough just to bring sacrifices. Some people misunderstand that and think that they're saying we don't need to bring sacrifice, we don't need to do ritual things. They do believe in the value of ritual, but ritual followed to the nth degree, paired with a human being who then goes out into the world and is what my grandmother would describe as a wilde chaya, as a wild animal, was a real disconnect for them. And so they believed that you needed to, yes, do righteous action towards God, but also righteous action in the world and live out your Jewish values in the world. And so I think for us as Jews, that's where it started. And so if we hear the prophetic, if we hear the call, I'm not a prophet and I'm not the son of a prophet, but if we hear their call and the way that they lived Jewish values in the world and the way they wanted to call upon the people of their time to live out the values, not just in the synagogue, although I believe deeply in synagogues, but outside the walls of the synagogue. I think that's always been a part. And when you read the Torah and you see all the passages we're studying, in my weekly Torah study group, we started years ago with Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, and we're going verse by verse, and finally we're in Leviticus now. It's how slow we go. But we're reading the holiness code right now in Leviticus 19. And it's so much about, it's so little, that section is so little about our relationship with God and so much about our relationship with other people and doing justice in a very practical way. We just read the passage that said you have to have fair weights and measures in your business. So like to that level of not putting your thumb on the scale, all the way to loving your neighbor as yourself and to treating the stranger as your fellow citizen. These calls come from deep within our tradition, and the question is, will we listen to them? And what do we mean by neighbor is a profound question as well. Do we only mean our fellow Jew? Do we mean all the people of the world? So that was a long-winded answer to your short question.
It was a rich answer to the question, and I appreciate that. Certainly. Thinking about pieces of what you said, you referenced the text from Isaiah about these are not the sacrifices that I desire, of meaning that it's about more than the ritual, it's about the ethics, it's about how we behave. How were the prophets received when they gave those messages to the people? I think that's an important part of this as well. We tend to, I think when you say, if you ask people what is a prophet, besides the joke of it's about profits and losses, if they got to what a prophet was in a biblical sense, they would also likely have an expectation that the prophets were listened to, because we talk about the prophets with a sense of reverence. How were they received during those times when they lived and actually were delivering their words?
They were often, I think we have images of the prophet Jeremiah having tomatoes thrown at him and being jailed for his prophecy, because they're calling out power, right? They're not speaking, just in their house. They're speaking in the public square. They're calling out the powers that be at the time. And that was, in many cases, a threat. And people, again, like I said before, regular folks didn't like being told, if you don't change your ways, disaster is going to strike. No one likes to hear that. And certainly when the prophets are speaking to the powers that be, whether that was the king or the priestly class, to be told you're not following the Torah, you're not following Jewish tradition, you're not upholding our end of the covenantal bargain. We see hints in basically all the prophets of the ways in which they were received, and the answer is not well. And it makes sense, again
Leads
and
to some of that
again.
reluctance that you were referenced before for
Exactly,
them.
that's exactly right. Like, many of the prophets start with like, oh yeah, no, pick somebody else. Starting with Moses, of course, right? Moses says pick somebody else like 11 times, and then into the books of the prophets themselves, they're reluctant. And it's easy to think like, is it false modesty? Like, oh, I'm not worthy, but actually, please pick me. But I think a lot of the times, because they know that the messages are not going to be. And there's even warnings in the Bible that say, if a prophet says to you, you're doing fine, don't change a thing, that's a sign that they're not a real prophet. So it was a hard job, I can't imagine. And they were largely not well received, but they kept doing it anyway.
They persisted over and again.
Exactly.
So, and even when they tried to run away, a la Jonah, they got dragged back in one way or another into the task that they were called to do. We're talking a lot about biblical prophecy and biblical roots of justice. Let's bring it into today's context. In your congregational work, how does the pursuit of justice find a place, and how is it received within a community?
I'm really proud to serve a congregation that has always seen justice work, or living out Jewish values in the world. That's how I would put it. As a core value. Our congregation is celebrating its 175th anniversary this year.
Mazel tov.
And so, thank you. And as part of that, I've been going back and looking to see, like what have been the themes of the congregation throughout its history, and it's been a lot of things. But I found a sermon from a rabbi, from the rabbi who was the rabbi during the Civil War, and he said he preached on Rosh Hashanah that former slaves should be, who are now serving in the army, in the Union Army, should be paid the same thing as white soldiers. And then you have the Women's Club in World War I, making bandages for wounded people, and you have the Rabbi Teitelbaum in the 1970s and 80s advocating for Soviet Jewry passionately, and I serve a congregation that's had a soup kitchen, a weekly soup kitchen, for 25 years, and even through the pandemic, we've continued with sort of bag lunches to serve the food insecure in our community. So I came to a congregation for whom living out Jewish values in our city and in our country is a profound core value. And so when I've brought the issues and concerns that I think that we could additionally have impact on, it's been well received. Look, there are times when I'll raise an issue and people don't want to hear what I'm talking about. I am not a prophet. I am not saying that I am, but I also believe that if rabbis, I don't know about you, Rabbi Miller, but if I come off the bima having given an impassioned sermon and the most reaction I get is, "That was such a nice sermon, Rabbi," I kind of feel like I don't know if I did my job. Like, I want people, our job is sometimes to comfort the uncomfortable. I'm not saying we always need to be agitating people, but if everybody only ever likes all the things that we say, then I think possibly we're not doing our job. That's not to say that we shouldn't be thoughtful. And I try in everything that I speak about to acknowledge that almost every issue has more than one perspective, and that I'm eager to hear people's different perspectives. Mm-hmm. Occasionally I speak about a thing that not everybody likes to hear, but I try and root my teachings in Jewish values. It's not my personal agenda. It's ideas that I think are deeply rooted in Jewish values, and where it's complicated, I acknowledge that it's complicated, and I think people appreciate the authenticity of that and appreciate that I actually am approachable when I say, if you disagree with me, come and talk to me. And then people take a chance to do that. And we have, in better times, non-COVID times, we have breakfast together, and they realize that we might in the end disagree for sure still, but they understand that I come from a place of compassion, and that I understand that they have reasons why they believe what they believe.
And those opportunities for civil discourse, for engaging and sharing,
Yes,
that really speaks to the power of relationships in a community.
absolutely.
That you not everyone's going to be on the same page. We're not all going exactly at the same speed, but when we engage with each other, we can build relationships that help us get to a place that there are always things that we agree that need to be addressed. We might not agree on the solutions to get there. So
Correct.
I know that you embrace the power of community organizing.
Mm-hmm.
What is it that does for you, and how does that impact your work when it comes to building relationships and connections in an effort to create a world that's a little more just and whole?
That's a great question, and it's you should cut me off because I'm sure I could talk your ear off about this. I think you've already had on your broadcast Rabbi Jonah Pesner. Is that right?
Yes.
So, from him, many of us have learned the value of building relationships across lines of difference, not only within our Jewish community, although there's difference within our Jewish community, but across lines of race and class and faith. And about 15 years ago, I think, or so, I started hearing about this guy, Rabbi Jonah Pesner, and the work that he had done in Boston, and work that he was doing in other places as well. And honestly, community organizing, when I first heard about it, felt like a thing that I was looking for but didn't know existed, in the sense that I had served congregations who had gotten all kinds of awards for their direct service, community, social justice work, and it's sacred work. End of story. Until we figure out why in the most wealthy country in the world there are so many hungry people, and how we can fix that problem, which we should be able to, we have to continue to have soup kitchens, and we need to continue to have food pantries. But I was starting to feel at that point, I don't know, about 7 or 8 years into my rabbinate, like some of the justice work, I guess I wondered why some of the justice work that we were doing in the congregations I was serving didn't feel like it was making a difference, but it wasn't changing anything. It wasn't changing underlying reality for the most part. And so then I met Jonah Pesner, and I started to hear about community organizing, which was a model that was about getting at root causes of the problems that we face. And I thought, wow, I don't know what that is, but that's what I want to be a part of. And so first in New Jersey when I was serving a congregation there, and now into New York, I've been a part of campaigns. I mean, the smallest, most parochial campaign that I was involved in was the school district in my town in New Jersey. The calendar came out, the school calendar came out, and it was the school was going to be closed on Rosh Hashanah, on Yom Kippur, but not Rosh Hashanah. And my congregants were freaking out. And I didn't know what to do with that story. And that day I went to my local ecumenical interfaith council, and I was like, this thing happened and I don't know what to do about it. And one of the other ministers said, Rabbi, that's not a Jewish story. And I thought, uh-oh, what does that mean? He said, I said, what do you mean? He said, no, that's a disrespect for faith problem. And if one faith is being disrespected, we are all being disrespected. And 10 ministers and I went to the school board meeting the following month, and miraculously the calendar was changed. And I thought, oh, this is what it means to work across lines of difference about things that could be of mutual interest. And from there, we got the Ford Motor Company to spend some hundreds of millions of dollars doing an environmental cleanup in the town, in the adjacent town, because they had done amazing things by building cars in the town, but they had also left behind a toxic legacy that was poisoning the homes and families of 400 Native American families who live in town. And I started to see what it could look like to work, again, with organized people and organized money to make a difference at some root causes. So those like the beginning stories of seeing how building relationships. I'd already lived in the town for 7 years, but I didn't know the other ministers really. And I didn't know that our concerns could be, the concern for clean water in our town, actually that cuts across all lines. So when we learned that there were hundreds of tons of toxic leftovers from making cars that were uphill from all of our community. It was like, this is not a Jewish issue or a Christian issue or a Muslim issue or a Native American issue. This is something that we all care about. And if we work together, we could really maybe be more powerful than any of us on our own. So that's what community organizing looks like to me. And that's why I'm a big believer in the model here in New York too.
Thank you for sharing that. And yes, Rabbi Pesner was our guest and talked to a little bit about the power of stories. You referenced stories and relationships and how you got that story about what had happened to you and you shared it and that happened, but it's the really deep personal stories that really connect the most. You've focused your work a lot in recent years around gun violence reduction. Share with us the story that brought you into that field.
Sure. Gun violence was a thing that I cared about growing up and, in youth group and along with many other things, that I cared about. But in January 1999, this thing that I cared about theoretically became much more personal. My father I had been ordained about 6 months before. Our oldest child was just short of 1 year old, first grandchild on both sides. And my father was murdered at his place of business in Chicago. Which was just a horrendous thing. And for many years after that, I didn't immediately become an activist on this issue, partially because I was dealing with my own grief and trials and trying to help my mom have some semblance of a new normal. And I honestly didn't know, as I started to be able to look up around and see like what was being done on this issue, I didn't really know what I could do with my story that would be real. Also, by then we had a second child who was named after my father, and our younger son didn't know why he was named, like how my father had died at the time when he was about 7 or 8 years old. And so it took a long time for me to figure out like what could I do. And after the mass shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School, some people include in the organizing network, community organizing network that my congregation in New Jersey and I had gotten involved in, they knew that I had a story that I wasn't telling, I think I preached about it once or twice in what at that point had been, 13 years. And so one of the couple of the key leaders from this national organizing network said, like, are you ready to tell your story? And I thought a lot about it and thought, first of all, I'm gonna have to tell my son how his grandfather died, because if I'm going to start speaking publicly, he's got to know first. And that was a hard conversation. And what began to evolve, I mean, we started to think about what might we do. There are lots of national gun violence prevention organizations, all doing sacred work, and some of them with much more money and a much bigger Rolodex than we will ever have. And so what we did not want to do was try and do what everybody else was doing, because that didn't need to happen. We didn't need to recreate something that somebody else was doing, only better and bigger. And so we started to think about and ask the kind of questions that we ask in community organizing, including who has what change would we like to see? Who has the power to make that change? And can we assemble enough power to make the people who can make the change actually do the thing? Mm-hmm. If we can't figure out what we want, we can't win. If it's just like, we'd like to reduce violence in this country, that's true, but like we have to get a little more strategic than that. We have to get a little more specific than that. So first is figuring out what's the change we'd like to see. If you can't figure out who can make that change, then just yelling into the street isn't going to do it. So you have to figure out who's the person or persons or business or company or governmental organization that can make the change. That's the second thing. And then the third thing is, can we make them do it? Because if we can't, then it's a lost cause. So we went through a process over a course of a few months to try and figure that out. And what evolved eventually was the Do Not Send Idly By campaign. But to your question, it started with story, not just my story, but the stories of ministers and pastors and imams who for years had been burying their congregants and consoling the bereaved. And we had to ask ourselves, do we want to do more than just console the bereaved and bury the dead? And are we willing to say to Congress and the president of both parties, by the way, of both political parties, who for years had done nothing? They had stood idly by, as the book of Leviticus says. They had, even after Sandy Hook, they decided to do nothing. They didn't forget to do anything. It didn't slip their minds. They didn't decide to do their hair instead of passing common sense gun violence prevention legislation. They decided to do nothing. So it was sort of a gut check for us about whether we really want it. And we had so many stories that were agitating us and moving us that we just felt like we couldn't stand idly by. And that's sort of the origins, for my own personal origin story in this work. But it's not my own personal campaign. It's not my own private crusade. It's people all over the country of faith, of different faiths and no particular faith, who have stories and who just are no further than 2 degrees removed from someone who's been killed by a gun over the last many decades. And we just felt like we had to do something. And so trying to figure out what that was the first step, but it started with story. Thank you for asking.
Thank you for being willing to share your story. I'm sure you shared it many times, but it took you a while to get to a place where you could tap into that experience. So yeah, every time is an emotional one. And I appreciate you opening up about what happened to your father and what moved you into this. So you identified you have to figure out what you want to change, who you're going to talk to, and how you're going to organize. What is the change? What are those 3 things for your Do Not Stand Idly By campaign?
For sure. In short, what we want is 2 things. 38,000 Americans roughly have died every year by gun for the last many decades. More Americans have died by gun than have died in all of America's wars combined. So the question is, how do we go at this problem? And there's lots of approaches, like I said. The 2 things, in short, that we want in our campaign is to reduce gun trafficking and to increase gun safety. The vast majority of gun dealers are responsible dealers. They follow local and state rules. Ultimately, they never have a crime gun traced to their store. The vast majority of stores are that way. But something like 40%, 60% of the guns that turn up in crime scenes are traced to about 1% of stores. And essentially almost all the crime guns that turn up in crime scenes can be traced to about 5% of gun stores. So what we want is for those bad apple dealers to be held accountable for the massive amount of gun trafficking that takes place in this country. That's one thing. That's the main, most important thing that we want that would be dramatically impactful. And the other thing is we acknowledge that the Second Amendment is a real thing. Our goal is not to roll back the Second Amendment. Our goal, if there's going to be guns, and there are 300 million guns in this country, almost 1 for every person in this country, for as long as there's going to be guns, we think guns should be as safe as they can be. And so we have seen and feel that there's a need, especially for citizens and law enforcement who have guns, that if they're going to have a gun, that it should be personalized to them, or at least have an opportunity for it to be personalized to them. Why is this important? So that, we hear too many stories of private gun ownership where guns that are in people's homes are used by a child, by a person in an emotionally distraught situation to harm themselves or others. If those guns were personalized, like my iPhone, right, recognizes my face or my thumbprint. We're not saying this is the only gun that should exist, but what we're saying is people should have the option to have a gun that can't be fired by their child or by somebody else in their home. For law enforcement, it could be helpful because law enforcement has a difficult job. And sometimes they confront people who might take their gun from them and use it to harm them. If guns were personalized to law enforcement officers and their partner and their chief, and the technology is on the way for that to be possible, then they wouldn't have to be quite as afraid when they approach someone they're afraid to that might grab their gun, because if they grab their gun and it's personalized to the officer, it can't be used against them. So those are the two things that we want. The question next is, who can make those things happen? Congress and the president can do things. And as I said already, Congress and presidents of both political parties have essentially done very little to help keep us safer, to help reduce gun trafficking. But the unusual focus for our campaign that we realized no one else was talking about was gun companies, gun manufacturers, the companies that have made the 300 million guns that exist in this country. They can control their worst dealers. They decide which stores they're going to sell their guns, their products from, just like the manufacturer of the chair that you're sitting in decided which stores they were going to sell their products through. Gun manufacturers could decide to not do business with the worst dealers in America. By the way, the good gun dealers that we've spoken to don't want the bad gun dealers either. They're like, they give us a bad name. So the manufacturers could decide to not do business with the worst gun dealers in America. And they could also innovate in gun safety. They innovate in killing power all the time. They could decide to create a kind of gun, not the only kind of gun. We're not saying it's the only kind of gun that should be available, but they could innovate in the area of gun safety. And they could do that, and they could frankly make a lot of money. It's possible, and sometimes we get critique from people to the left of us who say, oh, wait, if a smart gun, that's the term that's used, if a smart gun's invented, more people might buy guns because they think it's safe. There's a chance that that's going to happen. But so we think this is a win-win for gun manufacturers in that sense. So we know what we want. We know who can make the change. The question is, can we muster the power to encourage them to do that? And the strategy that we have, is to follow the money. Who might manufacturers listen to? We think they might listen to their biggest purchasers. 40% of the guns in this country every year are purchased by law enforcement, by local, state, and federal law enforcement. We think if 40% of their market share went to them and said, we will buy guns from you if you control your worst dealers and if you innovate in gun safety, we think that the manufacturers might listen. Additionally, their biggest investors, their biggest institutional investors, banks and investment houses, have real impact over the manufacturers, and they could say to them, we want you to take responsible steps, not radical steps, but responsible steps to help keep. And we think so. In the short version of the already long story is that we think it's in everybody's self-interest. It's in American self-interest to be safer. It's in the government and the police department's interest to have fewer guns on the street. And frankly, it could be in the self-interest of the gun companies. In other words, if the town of Naples, if the police commissioner in Naples said together with hundreds of other police departments across the country, said to the manufacturers, if you will control your worst dealers, that will be a factor in our purchasing. Next time we decide who we're going to buy guns from, we'll prioritize. We'll give you points in our acquisition process if you will work constructively, to play your constructive role to reduce gun violence. So those are the broad strokes of the campaign and the power dynamics that we think are in play.
Thank you for sharing that. That's very powerful, and it's a very comprehensive piece. I want to shift a little bit and allow some of the questions to come in. We've got a couple, we've got one or two on Facebook and a couple popping up here. One of the ones that came in is a question about wanting to know what surprised you along the way as you have done this work with Do Not Stand Idly By. Were there moments or things that surprised you or caught or were different than what you expected them to be?
That's a great question. I would say two things that are sort of different, but in a way kind of related. One is that as I've spoken about this issue over the last several years in different places, what has surprised me in a terribly sad way is how few degrees so many people, Jews and people of every faith, how close we all are to someone who has been affected by gun violence. Again, growing up in suburbia where I didn't know anybody at the time who had been killed by a gun, and then having this terrible tragedy in my family and feeling like, I don't know if like feeling alone in that in its own way. What's been one of the things that's been surprising is when I speak in synagogues or churches or mosques or any place or town halls or whatever, that so many people feel deeply affected by this issue, either directly or because they're afraid to send their kids to school, or they're afraid to go to a political event, or they're afraid to go to the movie theater. How pervasive Americans' fear is of gun violence. That's one thing. Second thing is how much it seems like we've become a nerd to gun violence. In other words, the idea that if 38,000 Americans were dying in a war every year, I feel like we would do something about that. We wouldn't just say, oh, this is just the price of being an American. But somehow we've become so inured to this issue that we've kind of collectively, even everybody, even people who care about the issue are like, oh, there's nothing we can do about this. I guess this is just what it means to be an American. That's a second thing. And the other thing is just that, as we've talked about our specific strategy, how actually people across lines of political difference have been intrigued by the idea of a market-based strategy, and how a moderate strategy that isn't about taking people's guns away. It's not about telling them the only kind of gun they can have. It's about reducing gun trafficking and about creating a kind of technology that, if you're going to own a gun, could keep you and your family safer. It's been heartening to hear how people who might disagree fundamentally about all kinds of politically charged issues have found this as a moderate approach. So those are some of the things that have surprised me in a variety of ways, for good and for bad.
Yeah. Another question has come in wanting to know, as you talk about wanting to engage people with tikkun olam and justice work, how do you engage young people in particular?
That's a great question. I mean, they definitely have an optimism about the world and an optimism about making change that some of us kind of lose maybe as we get older. Look, the shooting in Florida at the school there was a galvanizing moment for young people, and so they have been pushing us. I think they have been saying, what are you doing, and what are you leaving to us, and what is your generation doing about making this issue alive, and changing it. And so I don't know that we need to engage them as much as we need to listen to them and hear them. And I've spoken a lot with with some of the kids from Florida and different groups who've started up around this issue. And our goal sometimes can be to help them be strategic a little bit about what they want to do and how they want to make it work, how they want to make a change. But I haven't found it difficult at all to engage young people. I think this is an issue that they worry about a lot, and they are. I think we have a generation that is unwilling to say, this is just what it means to be alive in America in the 21st century. They're unwilling to just let it ride, and they want to do something to make a change on this issue. And so whenever I've spoken to young people in general about this issue, and specifically around our campaign, whatever it might be, they're pushing us to not just sit idly by while our neighbors bleed, not just to accept this as the price of freedom in America.
Another question has come in, going to what's happening right now with the pandemic. From your perception, has COVID-19 and the situation that we're in changed the way people look at their religion? And what impact do you think there will be over time as a long-lasting resonance of this pandemic?
A really important question. It's interesting because sometimes it's hard to see the trees when you're in the middle of the forest, or wait.
The forest through the trees, yes.
Right, exactly. So to a certain extent, I don't know how this will change us. I mean, part of me, and I've been talking a little bit about this in different settings of late, is from the religion perspective first, and then I can say something maybe broader. I don't know about at your congregation, but we've had attendance off the charts since March 13th, since the first Friday night that we were online for services. Like way more engagement in adult education than any time in my 4 years here in my current synagogue. Now, why is that? I've joked with my team, it's because we're awesome. But I think we were awesome in January too, and February, and we didn't have the kind of attendance that we have now. So what does it mean? It could also mean that people, like here in New York City, usually people have 10,000 things they could be doing on a Friday night. Not so much right now. So like we're the only game in town. I mean, that's also possible. But I think those things are true. And what I think is also true is that people crave, my mantra and my rabbinate is that what's the unique value proposition of religion and Judaism, and religion in general, Judaism in particular, is that through Judaism, you can find meaning and purpose and connection. And that even in the 21st century, even with all the technologies that we have, people still need meaning and purpose and connection. And what I think that in this COVID time, maybe of all of those three things, what people need most and feel the lack of most is connection. So when we have a Zoom service and 150 households log on, might be 300 people, and then we unmute at the end of services and there's that cacophony of like sound that at the Oneg would not be so cacophonous, but on Zoom. But you hear people saying, "Oh, Adam, oh, how's your family? How are the kids?" All the things. People need that now more than ever. They need connection because we feel so disconnected from each other. So I feel like religious communities and which I don't know that much about, but Judaism in particular, which I know something about, has served a purpose for people in this time that I think will be lasting in a profound way. The larger question of what comes next is an important one, and I think we have to ask ourselves a question, which is a hard one, which is, what do we aspire to? Do we aspire to go back to how things were on March 11th or whatever day it was? Or do we aspire for this time to change us as people in some ways, allow us to inspire us, agitate us to say, maybe we don't want to go back exactly the way things were. So those are questions that I think we should be asking ourselves now. Like, what is it that we want to go back to? We want to go back to businesses open. We want to go back to being able to hug each other. We want to be able to go back to feeling safe and not having to wear masks. All of those things, absolutely. Do we want to go back to exactly how things were in other ways? I think those are questions that we should ask ourselves.
Beautiful answer. We're nearing the end of our time, so just a couple more questions. One is, and this is from the audience, a couple people have asked, how do you keep your energy up at this level, doing all of this sacred work? It must be draining. What is it that gives you hope and keeps you going?
My colleagues keep me going. And I'm not just saying that because you're on, my friends. I'm a big believer that rabbis need rabbis, and you're one of my rabbis. And so when I can, in all seriousness, when I can reach out to colleagues who are going through the same struggles and just say, how are you doing and how are you making it through? That is important. My family, I should have started with my family. My wife's in the other room. She'll kill me for not starting with my family. My family keeps me grounded and helps me always, but especially now, remember what's important. The fact that I love the work and the fact that I love the people that I get to work with, makes everything easier. And that like I said, I still want to be a rabbi. I still believe, I still want to do this work. And then lastly, what I've said before too, which is just that I think faith can be such an important thing in people's lives. And at moments of, it's easy to I don't know. It's easy to do this work when things are easy and everything is good. Like, it is harder to do it in unusual ways that our rabbinic training never taught us how to do virtual Judaism. But when I feel people needing what we can give more than any time I can remember in my rabbinate, it's energizing, and it makes me want to do the work and makes me want to figure it out, and makes me want to work with my team and with, and, you know, the other thing is, the last thing on this point I'll say is that my wife and I have been saying, like, none of us do this work alone, and especially in this moment when we're all kind of like figuring our way through it. Back to the first point, when I can look to colleagues and just say, how are you thinking about this challenge that none of us have ever faced before? It gives me new strength and new optimism. A, that I don't have to figure it out by myself, and B, that there are creative solutions to every challenge that we're facing, and that we'll get through it. So I feel really energized even in this time. And I'm going on vacation tomorrow, and I'm ready for that too.
Well, I'm glad we were able to connect with you before you left for that vacation.
Of course.
You might not have made it on the path to being an astronaut directly, but you have certainly launched far off into space and inspired a lot of others to follow in your path. For those who might be watching you streaking through the sky and wanting to themselves do some work to fix the world, to address the problems that they see, what advice would you give them, Joel, as a starting point?
You know, I think it goes back to story. I always ask people, like, what are you wrestling with in your life? What keeps you up at night? What's hard for you? What would you like to change? And then if people have stories, which everybody does have a story, the next step is to invite them to wonder, do you think you're the only person who has that wondering or that struggle or that wrestling? And if you're interested in doing something about trying to figure out how to change that thing, maybe have 5 conversations with people that you know already, with whom you've never had that kind of conversation, and start and see if you are actually alone. I'm guessing you're not, whatever the concern is. And if you're not alone, then maybe those 5 people each have 5 conversations, and all of a sudden you have 25 or 30 people who are like, this thing that we're worried about, I don't know what we can do, but 30 of us care about it and we want to figure it out. And I think those are the ways. And the reason why to start there for me has become because I think when you start with story and when you know other people's stories, it builds a relationship with the other people where even if you don't ever do anything about that problem, you are going to be connected to those people in profound ways. When you see them on Yontiv, across the room, you'll know that you share a connection. If that's all that ever happens, Dayenu, we would say, it's worth it. And on the justice side of things, if you build connections with relationships, and then you end up getting into a battle, a good fight over on the issue, the relationships you built will help you endure the times when it doesn't seem like you're going to win, when it's hard, when you can't figure it out. But I really care about this other person deeply, not just they're my fellow congregant, although that's enough, but I know their story and they know my story, and together we'll stay in it even when it gets hard. And so that's what I'd suggest, and that's what I believe.
That's a great way for us to reach the end of our conversation. Thank you so much for sharing with us today, Rabbi Mosbacher, your passion for justice, your heart, and your story. Each time we gather for these One Spark conversations, we like to not just talk about these bigger issues, but also focus in on things that people can do, especially during this time of COVID-19, when we are much more cognizant of the blessings we have, as well as the challenges that have been revealed around us. And I think this week, in light of what Rabbi Mosbacher has just shared with us, our ask will be to have those conversations, to think about what it is that's motivating you, what it is that's keeping you up at night, or what it is that you want to see changed, and go and try to have 2 or 3 conversations, building on that theme of needing to create connections during this time of COVID-19, and building on the theme that we all have much more in common than we realize. Have those conversations, have those engagements, and really try to make the world around you a little bit better. We can all do it one step at a time. I want to thank everyone who is in our audience for watching and listening to our One Spark at a Time with me, Rabbi Adam Miller, and my guest today, Rabbi Joel Mosbacher from Temple Shaarei Tefillah in New York City. If you missed any part of this experience today or want to watch some of our past episodes or listen, the full video will be available on our Temple Shalom of Naples YouTube channel. And there's also the podcast series, One Spark at a Time, available on your favorite podcast provider. As Gandhi once said, be the change you want to see in the world. As we part ways, May you be inspired to embrace that teaching, knowing that you too have the power to fix our broken world, one spark at a time.